former senior reporter at The Root. I cover national politics with a specialty in race, gender, and kind of just really getting into how politics impacts our daily lives. So yeah, that's me.
Nice.
Yeah, excited to sit down and talk with you guys.
You've been focused somewhat on some of the more recent protests, I guess.
Yeah.
How do you feel that social media plays a role in the modern protest movements? And does it affect the way that you report on these protests? I know you talked about doing a story on something in the 80s. Like, do you see a difference with social media involvement now versus before?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a huge impact of the protests. I mean, on social media, because we can now see it directly. We aren't just hearing everything filtered through the press. Like, people like me would go and we would have our own beliefs or ideologies, and that filters into journalism. As much as journalists like to say that we're completely objective, we're all coming in with something. And so to have students now be able to share their message with us, and they have a lot of really great message discipline, you know, they're really sticking to their talking points for the most part. I think social media has really allowed them to talk directly to us as opposed to talking just to journalists. And that makes our jobs as journalists harder, but I don't think that's a bad thing.
That's
When it comes to since you said a minute ago that most of the protests on ground are a lot more mundane and that a lot of the clips we see are actually very sensationalized, do you feel that these sensationalized viral clips have any effect on policy at all? Like, do you see, because I've seen like the Republicans before who they'll see like, you know, the clips of certain like trans issues or whatnot, and that will motivate them to suddenly like implement some new policy based on like a viral tweet or something. Have you seen anything like that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really interesting, you know, outside of just those clips is the clips of, you know, politicians framing the issue. So I can talk about Mayor Eric Adams and also just the police department in New York City. I mean, they've been very focused on these, you know, bike locks, saying that they're this, I don't know if folks have been following this, but essentially just saying that the bike locks used by students were this kind of nefarious thing, or the tents that they were using, and they're all very mundane things, and I believe the bike locks were actually issued by the university. And so, you know, things like that. So yeah, I do think there are people who are really trying to sensationalize this and make it seem so much more dangerous and, you know, it is organized, but kind of using organization as a nefarious descriptor.
Interesting. It's such an interesting pro and con when you look at like old media that was very kind of controlled and direct and more simple, and like you said, that had that bias, and often an institutional bias, right, as like funders, whereas now you have that really authentic, but the more authentic something is, it's also more difficult to verify, right, and more easy to sensationalize because there's no checks and balances like there would be in a mainstream media source, which creates this really interesting dichotomy of, as a journalist, you can probably go in and get a really honest story from somebody, but you can also look on Twitter and see, like, I'm sure like George Santos posting some like crazy shit that's sensationalizing and making the protest look as bad as possible, or the anti-protest looking as bad as possible.
Yeah, no, I mean, our jobs are harder, but I think that's okay. I mean, yeah, there's a ton of disinformation that's spread on social media. I mean, I think using the bike locks and the tents and saying, you know, there must be some outside organization that's funding this, you know, that kind of stuff. I mean, that's actually just coming from in New York, the mayor. But there's a ton of misinformation that circulates on social media. And so the job of journalists now is whacking down some of that disinformation, but then also really trying to get people to trust us and share their stories. And, you know, if someone can go on TikTok or Twitch or any of these streaming platforms and just share their story directly, why give it to me? Right? And so that means we have to work harder, but I think that we should.
Interesting.
What are the steps you try and take to earn someone's trust? I mean, because I'm sure a lot of people are very hesitant talking to the media. I'm sure you've probably heard like the fake news or whatever, you know, stuff like that. So like, how do you earn people's trust in order to get them to really open up if you're trying to get like that really authentic story?
There are a lot of different ways that I do it. I think one big thing is I typically offer, particularly if it's a personal story, I offer an off-the-record conversation first. A lot of journalists don't like to do that because it takes more time, but if you have the time, I say use it. And so, yeah, I say, let's just talk and you can tell me whatever you need to tell me. And this isn't going in the story. It's not going to be used for anything. Let's just have that conversation. So that's what I do with someone. I mean, I've done some stories with people who've been in really difficult situations or people who've done things they're not proud of. And so having that initial conversation is always really useful. And then I think from there, it's also showing my body of work, showing that I've been dedicated to the issues that they care about. And that I'm not, just going to screw them over, frankly.
Right, yeah.
And that happens to people. I understand the fear, particularly marginalized communities who've been misrepresented in the media.
Yeah.
You just have to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge that someone talking to you is a privilege. Someone sharing their story with you is a privilege. It's not something they owe you.
When you get into like a group mob mentality, I think it sometimes pulls out behaviors from you that you maybe otherwise wouldn't participate in, which is why when you have protest clips of people doing like, to be honest, like not okay things like smashing up the Columbia Hall, you have to look at that and go, is that an actual representation of the individual? And so as a journalist, I'm super curious when somebody's like telling you their story and they're open about like maybe some criminal behaviors that they've done or things where when you look at this, you're like, this isn't really okay. How do you approach covering that within your stories? Would you mostly like overlook it, or how do you kind of make that decision of whether you include like the ugly sides of humanity in these stories?
Yeah, no, I think that's a super interesting question. I mean, I think everyone is a nuanced person. There are no terrible people and there are no good, just wholly good people. That's not how anyone is. And I think the most interesting stories have that nuance. But I think you have to think a lot about trying to think about like even how to phrase this, but kind of, okay, if someone's the worst thing someone's ever done, is it relevant to the story?
Right.
So if someone has, committed a crime in the past and it is not at all relevant to the story, I'm probably not going to include it. I'm not going to say, okay, you shoplifted when you were 15 years old and now we're talking about your abortion story. That's not really relevant, even if they tell it to me. But then sometimes things are relevant. So for example, I've done a lot of coverage of child welfare cases. And in some cases, past drug use is relevant because it plays into how the story played out.
Right.
And, I think the important thing is to tell people that everything that you say to me can end up in the story. We can talk about it, but like, I'm not just your friend. I'm not just your therapist. This is public.
Yeah.
So I think that's always something I tell people. Don't tell me anything, on the record that you don't want in print. Because public officials are different, but I think when you're interpersonally working with human beings, you have to really acknowledge that like people want to talk, people want to tell you their story, and I want them to know what they're signing up for. So I think that's kind of all part of the calculus, like how relevant is it to the story, and then also making sure that people understand that everything you're telling me could be included, and be careful.
I imagine that there are ways to support you personally and individually as a writer, because I feel like one of the most important things is making sure that the audience is clicking and funding the people and the type of media that we want to see. Every single person likes to complain how much they hate drama and they hate all that stuff, and then it's on and they're like glued to it and whatnot and putting all their money into it. And I get it. Hey, I love TLC, okay? It's my own...
I'm a Bravo fan.
Yeah, exactly. I get it, but I try to like vote with my dollar. And so is there a place where people can essentially vote with their dollar to support like your type of journalism?
Yeah, so you can read me a bunch of different spots. I've written for The Guardian, I've worked in The Washington Post, Mother Jones, The Root, so there are different places people can find me. But I also have a website, jess.washington.com, and so you can find me there, or on Instagram, which is jessica.washingtonjournalist.
Nice.
Yeah.
You should look at Substack.
I'm getting started on that.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I was going to say, Substack and Patreon feel like they're going to be your best friend.
That does seem to be the
model.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Elissa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Elissa Johnson. I'm the Vice President of Criminal Justice Campaigns at Forward.us and spend my time working on criminal justice reform. The work I do day to day is really around advancing data-driven policies to reduce mass incarceration and advance public safety. So that sometimes includes lobbying in particular states to try to change the laws, as well as just like talking about and educating voters and elected officials. I think we look back to the data, and so we're seeing where actually what makes us safer is reducing incarceration and not returning to those failed mass incarceration policies. And prior to the work I was doing now, I did prison condition litigation, primarily in Mississippi.
At one point in my career, I worked at a nonprofit that helped specifically with a lot of people who were unhoused or who came from incarcerated backgrounds when I was down in Memphis, Tennessee. And what we saw when we were down there, it was really sad because a lot of people who came to us, we would do intakes, and overwhelmingly most people who came to us for services or whatever, we would try to help people in that, in any way that we were able to, were repeat. They had been in prison multiple times, right? And what we heard over and over and over again was that many of these people were, well-meaning, hard-working people. They wanted to try and figure out how to get back on their feet. They want to try and figure out, what to do to be able to get out of these positions in their lives. But, once you're in the system once, especially down in the South, I can't speak as much to other areas because that's just out of my experience. But there were so few programs to help people get back on their feet, and the system was so oppressive to people when they went into it, that they were just kind of caught into a cycle where, for a number of reasons, they might be released from prison, they don't know what to do, they only have, I say skill sets in kind of a very loose term, they only know how to be able to make money or to be able to get by with unsavory means, they end up repeat offending, and it just over and over and over again to the point where they can't do anything, So I'd be interested in seeing what y'all have done to try and help with that.
I mean, I think, when you're talking about what do we do to support, I think there's a couple of things. One is that we know even 1 or 2 days of being incarcerated in jail destabilizes folks' lives, right? And increases the chance of rearrest. And then also I think we look at, in terms of people that sometimes are returning to prison, one of the important reforms that, various states have passed is essentially eliminating being able to go back to prison for what we call a technical violation, right? So something that's not a new offense. It's maybe you missed an appointment, or maybe, a variety, you failed to meet some condition, but really what you need is the support and help, right? To connect with services or figure out kind of how to traverse that, not just sending people back to prison for years on end when we know those sentences don't make us safer, and instead actually relying upon the investments that we see both in terms of services and other community supports that hopefully we're not having to experience the harm, right? That we're actually more thinking about if we're helping and make sure that people have supportive housing, if there's programs to help folks be able to make repairs to houses, that we see that actually leads to a reduction in arrest. One of the findings that we had in one of our recent reports on public safety was how Medicaid expansion actually saw a decrease in arrest from 20 to 30%. So I think when we think about public safety and we think about what works, the research is so clear and are actually good things for folks who are just as impacted, but also just our communities at large. It's interesting, in some recent polling we did, by a kind of nearly 2-to-1 margin, Gen Z voters very much understood that mass incarceration actually contributes to the things that make us less safe, right? In terms of substance use and mental health challenges and poverty and homelessness. And so I think that's in line with the research as well, right? So we see that voters of all demographics and ages and even political leanings understand that mass incarceration doesn't make us safer, but what does are all of these other investments, these other policies, and how in these moments right now and in a political cycle where again there's all this fear mongering, and if you watch the local news you might be violent crime is up, and that is not true. And so I think it's important to kind of stay grounded in the facts, and continue to push our local leaders, which I think is something, right, we can all do. And I think that's just the same way that we turn out on so many issues, that, reducing mass incarceration has to be kind of on that priority list because of what that means for all of our communities.
So how do we, I guess specifically, or what are your ideas to specifically help the re-entry process, since a lot of people, when they get out of prison, they have a lot of a harder time, getting a job and things like this. What are some of your ideas for how to improve that system, how it is right now?
I mean, I think one of the things you're seeing is that among business leaders, there's very much a renewed commitment to understanding that these are folks that can come back into the workforce and can be incredible employees, contributors, managers, across the sectors. And so one thing that we have is actually our People First initiative, which really is as much about making sure that we're not using harmful terms like felon or inmate to describe somebody who's been justice impacted, but also are there ways that we can support and help businesses not just recruit people that have been justice impacted, but also retain. So whether that's, for instance, maybe some benefits that folks may need so that they're able to go check in with their on supervision or parole or probation. It's not just the work that we're doing, but I think across seeing that people that have been to jail or prison or who have had, criminal conviction of any sort are just as able and interested and incredible contributors to our communities, to our workforce. And I think really making sure that we're doing everything we can, like personally and at those systemic levels, to remove those barriers and stigma.
So I guess I'm wondering, I'm trying to represent like the average younger viewer who might not be aware of all the ways that they can be able to get involved and make their voice heard. Voting obviously is one of the most important and like the baseline of where you should begin with. But like, what are the other means that you would recommend? Like, what are the tangible steps that they can take to try and make that happen?
I mean, often it's, you can call, right? You can call whether it's your local council member, your mayor, your state representative or state senator, and let them know how you feel about a particular policy that you've been reading about in the news. Maybe something that they're pushing to be like, hey, I think that's a good policy. Like, thank you for following the research and not pushing for mass incarceration, right? Or also saying like, hey, this doesn't seem like a good idea. This isn't going to make my community safer. Public education, right? Making sure, one of the things that's also, I think mayors can be an incredibly compelling voice on public safety because I think some of the initiatives, like thinking of just across the country, right? There's, mayors thinking like Baltimore, St. Louis, Montgomery that have like started offices of violence prevention, right? Or that are looking at a more public health approach to gun violence prevention. And I think those are programs to support. And also as we continue to push, our elected leaders to make sure that they're not lengthening sentences, they're not like passing mandatory minimums or rolling back some of the successful reforms. Because of the last 15 years of kind of concerted criminal justice reform, prison population's down 24% across the country.
That's great.
Oh, wow.
And so I think also it's like in this moment, like we can't afford to lose the momentum, right? We know we haven't gone far enough, but I think that I'm excited about like the energy from like young voters that like want to be a part of it, that like have a very clear idea that like both is like, yes, like how you feel about what makes you safer is like, that's what the data says. And like, there's so many ways like on social media, like in all different ways, right? In real life, virtually, to kind of like leverage our voices to make sure that we're like moving forward in a positive way that like strengthens communities. Thank you all so much just for inviting me to this conversation. Elissa Johnson, I work for Forward.us. You can find us on all the platforms at FWD.US, and just trying to, there's a lot of resources as well as other information. You can connect with me on Twitter at ElissaJ85.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elissa.
Great.
Really appreciate having you on.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Kunoor, thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to introduce yourself to the streaming world?
Hi everyone, I'm Kunoor. I am a longtime political operative, activist. Got my start in youth politics. Excited to be here. Great to be with you all.
Yeah. So it's really interesting that, especially like with your background focusing on progressive policies, right? Like, with us, with Progressive Victory, like obviously it's a really big focus of us as well.
Yeah.
And something that we were trying to figure out, especially with mobilizing young people, is how to be as effective as we can, obviously, but also to try and learn from some mistakes that other movements have made, that other progressive movements have made in the past, so that we're not repeating them, and so that we're, actually getting things done and actually getting people elected and policies passed, right? So what are some of the big lessons that you've learned from your experience that maybe we as an organization or that, young people going out can take with them, to try and actually get things done, right? And not just like talk about an abstract, like, no, we're actually going to get these things done.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is the way that you talk to young voters. I think that for decades, honestly, when folks would host the one single youth event that they would host of their entire campaign, the talking point was always, young voters don't need to vote, therefore you need to vote, and make that up. That's really unmotivating. So going to people with a message that's like more positive, enthusiastic, and focused on the issues and like their agency and like their power in the moment is way more likely to be successful.
Do you think that's why there's so much like young nihilism about politics, like specifically is because of the way that we've historically framed this of just being like, you should vote, which is like the most, it's like, you should clean your room. You're like, whatever, like, shut up, boomer.
I think some of it is definitely that. And then some of it is like, honestly, just like good, justified observation about how things are working in the world. Like young people are young. That doesn't mean they're stupid or uninformed. I think that a lot of voters, young people included, are pretty disaffected and disappointed with what's happening. So I think meeting folks where they're at, acknowledging that what they're experiencing is like real, and then talking to them about how they can change that is more of the path, rather than saying, no, you're wrong, you just got to vote your way through it. It's more like, this is how voting fits in within that broader conversation about all the stuff that's hard.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense, because I agree with Kyla's point that like typically top-down hierarchical, like you need to do X, Y, Z. Like a lot of young people, I don't know, we're also like young and rebellious, and we don't like taking authority. But beyond that specifically, I see a lot of young people where they're almost disaffected from the prospect of voting at all. And that gives me a lot of pause for concern, because I see the way to address a lot of the major issues in progressive politics through these democratic systems, like by mobilizing people to get out to vote, by mobilizing them to get more involved in their local, whether that's their city council or their school boards or what have you. And yeah, I guess I always am just curious about inspiring people to do that, rather than just like trying to give them the top down, like, this is what you should do. Like,
yeah, totally. It's about talking to them about their power, ultimately, and their agency and their ability to impact a thing. I mean, when people talk about swing states to young voters, for example, I don't think folks are telling young people what an outsized impact they can have. Like, I'm curious if anyone here knows what the state is that young people are most likely to determine the outcome in this year.
I have no idea.
Presidential. It's Wisconsin, right? There are
Really?
I think the margin of victory was something like 20,000 or a little bit less than 20,000 in the last cycle. If you talk to young people about what percentage.
So what you're saying is like people from Wisconsin, if you're watching and you're in Wisconsin specifically, you better get out and vote at a minimum.
Outsized power. That's
Finger
smaller
shake.
than UW Madison, I'm pretty sure. Like,
Yeah.
and when
that's
you put it
crazy.
in that context, like, there's your entire margin of victory, that one group of voters. And that's not the only state that's like that. That's just in the context of the presidential. If you break down the important races this election cycle, you can see that there are, probably like a dozen congressional races that are really similar. There are certain places around the country where there are more young people than there are old people. And that means that we have more voting power as long as we get out there. So just reminding people, like, you have a lot of power here and this could be your call. But then it is on you to make that call, and you do that by showing up, right?
I really appreciate your thoughts about engaging with younger voters specifically and organizing them. In the background of this, obviously, there are mayors from all across the country who are going to be organizing in DC. And I guess I'm curious about your experience with interacting with, obviously you have experience working on Bernie's campaign, interacting with the more localized campaign officials or the more localized politicians, where, as we discussed with some people earlier, there's a lot less incentive to focus on younger people, I think, from more localized elected officials, because it's like, well, if you're college students, you're going to be out of here in a couple of years. I don't know, like, what's been your experience, or have you seen differently?
Yeah, I think that local elections are some of the places where we've seen young activists be most effective. So you can say what you want about campus voters coming up and leaving after they graduate, but there was a big youth organizing effort, I want to say, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that followed that. And young people in Chicago, including high school students, college students, young people who weren't in school anymore, were all organizing both against police violence, police brutality, and against gun violence in the city. And there's been a long history of doing that. Deep infrastructure. That national campaign manifested locally in a demand to pull police officers out of schools. It's been a ton of information that young people have shared about, the dangers that poses to them and their friends, how much more likely they are to be incarcerated or targeted if there's a police officer on campus. And so their demand was really clear. They had been taking that to the mayor. The mayor hadn't done anything about it. That mayor did not get reelected. They elected a new mayor, Brandon Johnson, really progressive, much more reflective of their values. And one of the first things that he did was pull the cops out of schools. Would he have done that without that youth movement? I am skeptical. Were young people a big part of that mobilization to get him into office? I think probably. And that, that's just one example. There was a massive national uprising with the March for Our Lives, and I think that a lot of youth infrastructure was built on college campuses and high schools around the country. But the way that, even though you haven't seen a lot of that translate into federal law, you have seen interesting things happening in the cities.
Yeah, like shout yourself out.
I don't post a ton online, but you can find me on Twitter. My name, it's at Kunoor Ojha, KUNOOROJHA. Thanks a ton for having me. This was really fun.
Yeah,
so
thank you
much.
so much.
Questions.